The most dangerous part isn't the insult. It isn't the betrayal. It isn't the manipulation. It isn't even the moment they turn everyone against you. People think the worst thing another person can do is attack your reputation, but they are wrong. The real damage begins when they convince you to defend yourself, because the moment you start explaining your worth to someone determined to misunderstand you, you have already surrendered your power. Most people never realize this. They believe strength means proving, explaining, convincing, correcting, defending, fighting for understanding. But the true horror begins when you discover that some people were never seeking understanding in the first place. They were seeking access, access to your attention, access to your emotions, access to your reactions, access to your peace. And every explanation you offered became another doorway they could walk through. Every defense became another rope they could pull. Every emotional response became another confirmation that they still controlled the signal. What feels like communication is often captivity. What feels like defending yourself is often volunteering for another round of psychological warfare. And that is why the most powerful people in any room rarely waste energy explaining themselves. Not because they have nothing to say, because they understand something most people learn only after years of suffering. The person who controls your reactions controls part of your life. The person who can provoke you at will owns a key to your nervous system. And the person who constantly demands explanations is often demanding something far more valuable than words. They are demanding your psychological sovereignty. Stay with me, because what happens next changes everything. There is a principle hidden beneath nearly every toxic relationship, every manipulation cycle, every exhausting conflict that drains the life from a person. It is a principle so simple that most people overlook it, yet once seen, it becomes impossible to unsee. The first law of psychological power: not every invitation deserves a response. Most people spend years believing they are obligated to answer every accusation, every misunderstanding, every criticism, every attack, every demand. But psychological maturity begins the moment you realize that attention is not free. Attention is life. Every minute spent defending yourself to someone committed to misunderstanding you is a minute stolen from your future. Imagine a fortress standing on a hill. For years, its gates remain open. Anyone can enter, anyone can leave, anyone can bring chaos into its halls. At first, this seems kind, generous, compassionate, but eventually the fortress begins to crumble. The guards become exhausted, the walls weaken. The kingdom inside slowly forgets what peace feels like. This is what happens to people who never protect their attention. Their minds become public property. Their emotions become community resources. Their peace becomes available to anyone willing to demand it. And they wonder why they feel exhausted. Not because they are weak, because they are unguarded. Years of silent suffering often begin this way. A person becomes everyone's emotional shelter, everyone's therapist, everyone's rescuer, everyone's source of understanding. They absorb pain that was never theirs to carry. They forgive betrayals that should have ended relationships. They stay long after respect has disappeared. They become a sponge for suffering. And like a sponge left submerged for too long, eventually they become saturated, heavy, drowning in emotions that do not belong to them. They build bridges for people who only burn them. They pour themselves into bottomless wells. They sacrifice identity in exchange for temporary peace. Each compromise feels small, harmless, necessary. But years later, they wake up unable to recognize themselves. The person in the mirror feels distant, foreign, exhausted, because self-abandonment never arrives as a single catastrophe. It arrives as thousands of tiny surrenders, one explanation at a time, one justification at a time, one apology at a time, one more chance, one more conversation, one more attempt to be understood, until finally something changes, not dramatically, not loudly, not publicly, quietly, terrifyingly quietly. A switch flips, a lock turns, a receiver shuts down, and the person who spent years trying to save everyone suddenly stops trying. No screaming, no revenge, no announcement, just silence. The kind of silence that feels like a bridge collapsing in the darkness, the kind of silence that changes everything, because the breaking point is rarely emotional. It is neurological. The nervous system finally reaches a conclusion the conscious mind resisted for years. There is nothing left to explain. There is nothing left to prove. There is nothing left to save. The signal goes dead. And for the first time, the manipulator hears nothing coming back. That is when panic begins. Because manipulators survive on reaction. Reaction is oxygen. Reaction is proof of influence. Reaction is evidence that the leash still exists. But when the leash snaps, something remarkable happens. The person they thought they controlled becomes psychologically invisible. No argument, no defense, no emotional performance, no access, only distance. And distance is something control cannot survive. Psychologists often describe a phenomenon in which suppressed traits eventually return with tremendous force. The parts of ourselves we bury do not disappear. They wait. They watch. They gather strength beneath the surface. The boundary you never enforced. The anger you never expressed. The instinct you never trusted. The truth you never spoke. All of it remains alive in the shadows. And eventually those shadows begin moving toward consciousness, not to destroy you, to complete you. The greatest transformation is not becoming someone new. It is reclaiming the parts of yourself you abandoned in order to be accepted. Many people mistake this stage for becoming cold, but they are wrong. They did not become cold. They became complete. The version of themselves that once feared rejection finally learns a shocking truth. Rejection is survivable. Self-abandonment is not. And once that realization takes root, the fortress begins rebuilding itself. New walls rise, new gates appear, old entrances seal shut, not from bitterness, from wisdom. The house is finally secured, and the people who once walked in without permission suddenly find themselves standing outside locked doors. This is where the second law of psychological power emerges. Never explain yourself to someone who profits from your confusion. Most people assume manipulation is a form of strength. It is not. Manipulation is dependency disguised as power. The manipulator depends on your reactions the way a fire depends on oxygen. Every emotional response keeps the system alive. Every attempt to clarify, justify, defend, or correct becomes another log thrown into the flames. What makes this dynamic so devastating is that it rarely appears malicious at first. It appears as concern. It appears as misunderstanding. It appears as a desire for communication. Yet beneath the surface lies an invisible transaction. They provoke, you react, they gain certainty, you lose energy, they gain access, you lose peace. The cycle repeats until one person finally stops participating. And when that happens, something fascinating occurs. The manipulator experiences a form of psychological starvation. The guilt that once worked suddenly falls flat. The accusations that once triggered panic no longer find a target. The emotional hooks swing through empty air. The carefully rehearsed apologies begin sounding hollow. The love bombing that once felt intoxicating now feels scripted, transparent, predictable, like watching a magician perform a trick after discovering how the illusion works. The spell breaks, the illusion shatters, the curtain falls, and for the first time, the person who once felt trapped sees the machinery behind the performance. The manipulator becomes confused because the old buttons no longer work. They increase pressure, they escalate drama, they attempt to resurrect old patterns, they send messages designed to provoke guilt. They manufacture crises, they resurrect old memories, they attempt to reopen doors that have quietly been sealed, but the person they once controlled is no longer standing where they left them. Something fundamental has changed. The emotional receiver has been disconnected, the signal has been extinguished. It is like watching someone repeatedly knock on a house that no longer belongs to them. The lights are off, the locks have changed, the ownership has transferred. And the most unsettling part for the manipulator is not the silence itself. It is what the silence represents. The silence means access has ended. The silence means influence has expired. The silence means the game is over. This is the third law of psychological power. The moment you stop needing someone to understand your truth is the moment your truth becomes untouchable. For years, many people unknowingly surrender authority over their identity. They allow critics to define them. They allow manipulators to judge them. They allow strangers to determine their worth. They spend endless hours attempting to repair perceptions they never created. But there comes a moment when a profound realization arrives. Other people's opinions are often projections of their own fears, wounds, limitations, and unmet needs. What they accuse you of frequently reveals more about them than it does about you. This realization changes everything. Because once you stop carrying responsibility for another person's distorted perception, an enormous psychological burden falls away. The chains dissolve, the leash is severed, the invisible prison door swings open, and suddenly there is space, space to breathe, space to think, space to become. What emerges next is not emotional numbness, it is something far more powerful. It is psychological immunity. The third stage of transformation is often misunderstood because it looks quiet from the outside. There are no dramatic speeches, no declarations of victory, no public revenge. Yet internally, an extraordinary reconstruction is taking place. Years of emotional chaos begin settling like dust after a storm. The nervous system that once lived in constant anticipation finally experiences stillness. The mind that once searched endlessly for approval discovers self-trust. The heart that once chased validation begins returning home to itself. This is where true sovereignty begins, not when circumstances change, not when other people apologize, not when justice arrives. Sovereignty begins when your inner state is no longer controlled by external behavior. Imagine a fortress that has survived a siege. The walls are scarred, the gates bear marks of battle, yet they stand stronger than before because every weakness has been identified and reinforced. That is what emotional maturity feels like. Not perfection, reinforcement. Every betrayal teaches discernment. Every disappointment teaches boundaries. Every manipulation teaches awareness. Every loss teaches self-respect. What once threatened to destroy you becomes the material from which a stronger self is constructed. Psychological growth often follows a paradoxical pattern. The very experiences that appear to break a person frequently become the experiences that awaken them. The collapse becomes the catalyst. The darkness becomes the teacher. The wound becomes the doorway. And this is why some individuals emerge from suffering with extraordinary clarity. They no longer chase what once controlled them. They no longer negotiate with disrespect. They no longer confuse attention with love. They no longer mistake sacrifice for intimacy. They begin seeing reality without the filters that once distorted it. The world becomes quieter, simpler, clearer, not because life becomes easy, because illusion becomes visible. This is the fourth law of psychological power. Detachment is not the absence of caring. It is the refusal to surrender yourself while caring. Many people fear detachment because they associate it with coldness, but genuine detachment is actually one of the highest forms of emotional intelligence. It means remaining compassionate without becoming consumed, loving without abandoning yourself, helping without becoming responsible for another person's choices, listening without absorbing another person's chaos. It is the ability to stand in the storm without becoming the storm, the ability to witness manipulation without participating in it, the ability to remain calm while others attempt to manufacture emotional emergencies. And when this ability develops, something remarkable happens. Life begins responding differently. Toxic individuals lose interest because their tactics no longer work. Drama loses its attraction because it no longer stimulates the nervous system. Conflict loses its power because there is nothing left inside you that needs to prove itself. The old emotional triggers begin rusting away like forgotten chains at the bottom of the ocean. What once controlled you becomes irrelevant. What once terrified you becomes insignificant. What once consumed your thoughts becomes little more than a distant memory. And eventually the final stage arrives. The stage most people misunderstand. The stage often mistaken for bitterness, but which is actually freedom. Indifference, not cruel indifference, not hostile indifference, not the indifference of resentment, the indifference of transcendence. There is a profound difference between no longer caring because you are wounded and no longer caring because you are healed. One comes from pain, the other comes from wisdom. At this stage, the person no longer feels compelled to explain themselves. They stop defending every decision. They stop correcting every false narrative. They stop seeking validation from people committed to misunderstanding them. They stop hoping toxic individuals will finally change. They stop waiting for closure from those incapable of providing it. They stop standing outside locked doors begging for entry. Instead, they quietly build a life so meaningful that the old battles lose all significance. The energy once spent fighting becomes creation. The attention once spent proving becomes living. The emotional labor once spent rescuing becomes healing. And something almost mystical begins to happen. Peace arrives. Not dramatic peace, not temporary peace, deep peace. The kind that cannot be purchased. The kind that cannot be manipulated away. The kind that emerges when a person finally stops abandoning themselves. This is the fifth law of psychological power. The highest form of power is becoming unreachable to what once controlled you, not because you escaped, because you evolved beyond it. The insults may still exist, the criticism may still exist, the manipulation may still exist, but it no longer reaches the place inside you where power resides. It is like arrows striking fortress walls that have become too strong to penetrate. The attacks continue, the damage does not, and this is where the greatest transformation occurs. You realize the battle was never about them. It was never about their approval, never about their understanding, never about their acceptance. The battle was always about your relationship with yourself. The war was internal. The victory is internal. The freedom is internal. Because in the end, psychological power is not forcing others to respect you. It is respecting yourself enough to walk away from those who never will. It is not controlling other people. It is refusing to be controlled by them. It is not winning every argument. It is no longer needing the argument to begin with. The silence you hear at the end of this journey is not emptiness. It is not loneliness. It is not defeat. It is the sound of chains falling away. It is the sound of fortress gates closing against chaos. It is the sound of an old identity dissolving into something stronger, something calmer, something untouchable. They thought your silence meant weakness. They never understood it was transformation. They thought you were withdrawing. In reality, you were returning to yourself. They thought they were losing influence. What they were actually witnessing was the birth of sovereignty, because they were never losing you. You were finding yourself, and the silence they can no longer understand is not the absence of power. It is the sound of a soul finally becoming whole.